talk to us about the business of fighting climate change. Thanks for coming, Ethan.
Thank you. I'm going to stand back here. The microphone is on. Try to speak.
We'll get it on. Go ahead.
I can just talk, so I mean, everyone hear me? Okay? Okay. All right, great. So my name is Ethan Elkind. I am affiliated with both law schools. It's kind of a non-traditional arrangement, but it comes out of a particular initiative that I've been working on. I'm based at UC Berkeley, but I've been working on a partnership initiative between UCLA and UC Berkeley on this topic, essentially, on the business of fighting climate change. So it's an initiative that's looking at what are the business opportunities in California, now that we have a regime here under AB 32 to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. And, I always wondered for a while, what's so special about 1990? I was alive at that time, many of you were alive then. Didn't seem like a great year to me, but you listen to the climate scientists, if we can get back to 1990 levels by 2020, it'll start to put us on the curve we need to get to mitigating climate change in general. And hopefully, the idea is that in California we can set an example and innovate industries and develop best practices that can be a model for other states and other countries, and hopefully have a global impact, and in the process, make some money for businesses. So that's the idea, that we need some business innovation to tackle this problem. So I'm going to just give a quick overview of the initiative I'm working on. Is this on now? Okay, it looks like it's on, so I won't scream anymore. I'll give a quick overview of the initiative, and then I'll kind of launch into the presentation. So it's the Climate Change and Business Research Initiative, and the idea behind it is to connect business, environmental, academic, and government leaders in facilitated dialogue. So we have workshop discussions where we gather stakeholders for meetings, and then we draft policy reports based on the discussion. I brought a few here, so it's kind of a first come, first serve. We've done about various topics. So we've been addressing generally environmental and energy issues, but we've covered, since it's climate change, it touches on almost every business sector in California. We've looked at infill housing, we've looked at renewable energy, agriculture, transit, water and the water energy connection, and retrofitting your homes and businesses to make them more energy efficient. So we've done 10 of these workshops and have released 9 white papers. And this is, you're looking at the extent of my PowerPoint animation skills here. This is, that's 9 of the white papers we've released. Like I mentioned, I brought a few of them for those of you who want to jump up and grab them. But they're, like I said, on a bunch of topics related to climate change. And the basic thinking here, just to kind of take a step back and think of the kind of big picture in California, is that we do need these business innovations to happen here. And it's at the point where we have a legacy environmental movement that has been very effective at cleaning our environment, but a lot of that involves stopping things. I mean, if you think about what the environmental movement is geared up to do, it's to keep things from happening, it's to keep pollution from happening, it's to keep development from happening in certain areas, it's to keep large projects from going forward. I mean, I don't want to be too simplistic, but it's been a movement about conservation and conserving, and that's what's, I think, animated a lot of people. It's stopping that pollution, it's protecting their neighborhoods from the impacts of industrial development. And the irony is that we're now faced with this overarching issue that's facing the planet, overarching in terms of the environment, of climate change, and we need to start building our way out of this mess to some extent. I mean, unless your solution is that we all shiver in the dark and deindustrialize, what we are going to be relying on to keep the standard of living that we have, the lifestyles that we have, enjoy the technology that we enjoy, we need technological innovations, we need certain businesses to do things. And it's almost gotten to the point where if you want to make an impact on the environment, you're almost better off in some cases joining certain industries, working for certain businesses, than going into certain environmental groups. I mean, I'm not saying this as an anti-environmentalist, I consider myself one, but as somewhat of an outsider to the environmental organizations working on the academic side, you see that what we're dealing with now a lot of times are conflicts between businesses that are doing things that ultimately would help the environment from a carbon perspective, butting up against traditional environmental laws, and in some cases environmentalists who have a different agenda and are conditioned to stop a certain infill project, or they're geared up to, for example, if you look at high-speed rail, which I know is a controversial project, there's a lot of environmentalists opposed to that when you can make a pretty strong argument that high-speed rail is ultimately delivering some pretty good carbon benefits for the state. I know there's debate about it, but so you start to dig into these issues where the rubber hits the road on climate, it's been an interesting dynamic. And so I think from a sort of philosophical standpoint, I think our perspective is we need business innovations to get us out of this problem, and that means on the land use side, we need infill real estate developers. We need the expertise of those who know how to build developments in our urban areas with our existing urban footprint so people can walk and bike and take public transit. We need clean tech innovation. We need renewable energy folks. We need folks on the energy storage side, smart grid, to make our grid cleaner and more efficient. And we also need a whole army of contractors who can go out to our building stock, our homes and small businesses, and make them more energy efficient and capture those really cost-effective savings. So this is the kind of the challenge, I think, with climate change, is trying to build our way out of the problem that we're facing, and hoping that some of these innovations and best practices take hold. And that's been the kind of guiding principle, I think, behind this initiative. I mean, it's a partnership with UCLA and UC Berkeley, so I guess I'll mostly speak for myself on this, but that's, I wanted to share that with you in terms of the kind of underlying values and outlook about this. So while we think of it as an environmental initiative, the tensions have been interesting. So I'm going to talk about 4 key areas here of addressing climate change, and particularly how the business community can address climate change. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is land use, and particularly those infill real estate developers that I was talking about. Secondly, energy efficiency upgrades, or retrofitting the existing housing and small business stock to make it more energy efficient. We'll look at some renewable energy sector and advancements there. And then finally, looking at some innovations to integrate that renewable energy into our existing grid on the energy storage and smart grid side of things. So let's look at California's carbon footprint. As part of my job, I look at this pie chart more than I ever thought I would. How many of you are familiar with this pie chart? Okay, good. So we've got some folks out there. So I love this thing. This is basically our footprint, our carbon footprint, and where it comes from here in California. So when we think about our greenhouse gas emissions, you can see the biggest wedge there on the right is transportation. And that's 38% of our greenhouse gas emissions as calculated, I guess, for the last 8 to 10 years. So it may have changed a little bit, it may have gone up, but it's bigger in California than nationwide. Nationwide, it's around 33% of our carbon footprint, as best as the data tells us. So when we think about trying to address this particular chunk, I may have to go back to this chart as we go through the other areas so you get a sense of where all these pollution sources come into play. If we think about how to address that chunk, there's basically 3 ways to address the greenhouse gas emissions that come from, essentially from the driving that we do in the state. So it obviously comes from, if you look at that little 3-legged stool there, if you look at the green chart, you've got the vehicles themselves, meaning how fuel efficient are those vehicles. So if you wanted to get at those emissions, for example, more hybrids, more electric vehicles, that would be a way, or just a higher fuel efficiency standard, that would be a way to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at the middle leg there, it's a fuel. So it's taking the carbon content out of the fuel. So any of you have heard of the low carbon fuel standard? This is one of the Air Resources Board key regulations for how to reduce the carbon footprint in California. There's been a lot of talk about cap and trade. I think a lot of people, maybe somewhat casual observers to how California is fighting climate change, think that cap and trade is our big strategy. And it is a big centerpiece of Air Resources Board's agenda for getting us back to those 1990 levels. But the low carbon fuel standard by itself is almost half of the carbon benefits of the entire cap and trade system as they envisioned it in the scoping plan. The Air Resources Board envisioned it. So that's a big chunk of it. But then finally, you've got the stool there, the stool leg on the right, the vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. And basically this means the amount of driving. And the studies that we've seen indicate that even if you try to decarbonize the fuel in that middle stool, and if you have more efficient vehicles, you still are faced with the problem of rising vehicle miles traveled, and it ends up swamping the benefits of addressing those other 2. So essentially what you need to do is reduce driving. And some people get really bullish and say, well, do we really need to change how much we drive? I mean, electric vehicles are really coming online, more hybrids. But if you think about even the most optimistic projections for electric vehicle deployment, for example, Nissan has a goal of 10% market share of electric vehicles by 2020. I mean, it still means that in 8 years from now, 90% of our vehicles, our new vehicles, are going to be using fossil fuels. So, that's basically we're faced with the fleet turnover and with the even optimistic projections. Fossil fuel vehicles are going to be with us for most of our lifetimes. For those of us in this room who hopefully will have a nice long life. And so what we need to do is get at the amount of driving that happens, and that has to do with our land use patterns. It has to do with where we build our housing and where we locate our jobs, where our services are located. So if you live in a community where you have to get into a car to do everything, then you're going to end up driving a lot, even if you're driving a hybrid. In some cases, because you're driving a hybrid, you might feel liberated to go drive more. This is actually an effect that's been documented. You still are going to be not benefiting the environment and climate in terms of your carbon emissions. So we need to push for smarter land use patterns. And my first bullet point here is market demand, because when you start talking about where we live, how communities are designed, you get a lot of pushback from people who say, well, this is Soviet-style planning. They don't like the idea of smart growth. Some elite person telling everyone what's a smart way to live. And I think there is maybe some legitimacy to those reactions to the rhetoric. But the reality is, in California and I think across the country, is that there is a vast unmet market demand for a different kind of lifestyle, for one that doesn't involve what we think of as a traditional American dream, where you have a single-story, detached, 2,500 square foot home out in the suburbs, 2-3 car garage, driving to work. It's not to say that that model doesn't still work for people. I mean, there is definitely a lot of families that's an attractive way to live. There are people who may just like the peace and solitude, they don't mind driving. But we have a large segment of the market that we have not built housing for. And if you look at some of the studies in the building industry, they say we've already overbuilt this kind of single-family detached style of homes, well out into the future. And by contrast, if you look at some of our urban neighborhoods, demand right now is really almost out of control in certain parts of the state in terms of young people who don't have children, couples without children, seniors who want to move back into a more vibrant neighborhood. So there's these market segments that want to move back in there, and you see it in a lot of the housing industry data, you see it in the building permit data, and you see it in terms of where the housing collapse has hit places the worst. I mean, there's certainly, the outlying areas got hit the hardest by the housing collapse, and the areas closer to town ended up doing a lot better. Some of that's related to gas prices, and I think a lot of it is related to a generational shift and a kind of a cultural shift that a lot of folks want a different kind of lifestyle. So that's the kind of the good news, I think, is that what we're trying to do, what we need to do as a society wants to do anyways for a whole host of other reasons besides benefiting the climate. I think people want a more convenient lifestyle. They don't want to sit in traffic all the time. They want to be able to walk places. They want a vibrant neighborhood. They want to have a mix of services that they can access. So I want to kind of have that be the kind of context when we think about these issues. But of course, also for AB 32 reasons, our climate change goals, we want to see people in lifestyles where they don't have to drive so much. And that means having communities that are designed more holistically. And SB 375, I'm sure many of you have heard of this law. This is California's kind of landmark. It was described as a landmark kind of anti-sprawl law passed in 2008. It's extremely complicated. If any of you are looking to fall asleep, if you have trouble sleeping, I recommend that you print out this PDF of this legislation and try to look through it. It's mind-numbing, and it's hard to explain, but the basic idea is in California, we do transportation planning on a regional scale. So the regions, the major regions, the Bay Area, all the counties of the Bay Area, Southern California, San Diego, do transportation planning in the sense that they get together and they document what are their list of needs for projects, for funding transportation projects, highways, roads, and transit. And that's their big funding document that they will turn over to the state and federal government to basically draw down state and federal funds to be spent in that way. And what SB 375 does is now incorporate a sustainability element into that plan, where there's a chapter of that plan, that regional transportation plan, that now has to take into account future housing growth, future job growth, and travel patterns, and now try to meet a target given to them by the Air Resources Board of VMT and greenhouse gas reductions per capita. So it's not a mandatory thing. If they don't end up doing it, they don't all get thrown in jail.
It just means they have to do an alternative plan if they can't meet it with the plan they have in there. But it's a planning exercise, and they put it in there as a chapter, and everything within that document by law has to be consistent with it. So now they have to order their transportation projects according to that regional vision of growth. So it's not a revolution, as I've heard one advocate describe it. It is more of an evolution, in the sense that it's starting to bend the curve, that now the new transit projects that are being programmed are going to have to be focused in these areas where they actually project housing growth. So we're not going to be building new overpasses and new off-ramps out in rural areas and encouraging developers to develop out there because we made it easy for them by building roads. We're now trying to focus the dollars where we know the growth is going to be. I mean, that's the idea behind it. And there are some real kind of strings attached, real incentives. So you qualify for federal and state money better if you have a plan that's aligned. There are also some environmental relief that comes along with it. So I put up a bullet point here, CEQA exemptions. Has everyone here heard of CEQA? Sure, some head nods. California Environmental Quality Act. This is a law in California that requires essentially a public process, in advance review of the impacts of a project that's being considered, major projects. So if you have a big development project in an urban area, it can be quite challenging. A lot of developers complain bitterly about this process because they'll invest a lot of money up front to getting a project built, and then they have the unknowns of, was the environmental review inadequate? Are they going to get sued by someone, maybe a competitor? This is what they often like to complain about. Maybe not. Maybe someone who doesn't want, a rich person doesn't want their view blocked. You get those kind of complaints. I mean, the flip side of it, I think, if you listen to folks who really are advocates for the CEQA process, it also gives a real strong tool to local communities to have some control over what gets built in their community. So it's, the arguments are good, I think, on both sides. But the challenge is that in California, we need to do everything we can to make sure we're building in these infill appropriate sites. And so the state has recognized that CEQA has been an obstacle for investment in these areas because it creates so much uncertainty and can cause a lot of delay for these projects. So SB 375 contains some streamlining provisions for review, so you can basically get out of having to do environmental review in some areas if your project is compliant with this overarching regional view. And we also have just some standalone CEQA streamlining and other exemptions. Personally, I'm most interested in one that came out of the last legislative term. You may have heard of some of these CEQA reform efforts. For example, the LA football stadium. Has anyone heard about this controversy last year? So, LA wants a nice downtown football stadium, and the developer was able to get almost a free pass from CEQA in exchange for a whole bunch of mitigation measures that they would agree to in advance. And that got a lot of attention, and I don't have much to say about that. I don't want to wade into that controversy. But kind of a sleeper CEQA reform bill was SB 226. And basically what it does is it allows smaller infill projects to avoid environmental review where it's already happened at a larger programmatic level. So if a local government has already kind of done some planning on their community and they've already looked at, in a general sense, impacts, then the smaller projects that come along could take advantage of that prior review and not have to go through kind of what they would call a duplicative level of review. We've had this in California already. To some extent, it hasn't worked great. But the difference now is that the state is now defining which projects can be eligible to qualify for those benefits. So for the first time, the state, through the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, is actually defining what a good infill project is. And it's a hard thing to do. It's like that old adage, I know it when I see it. It's not that simple with infill. And they're having an interesting process about what constitutes a good infill project. And their big metric is VMT, vehicle miles traveled. So if you have a project that, through the existing modeling that we have, you can show that it'll be in a low VMT area, then you can qualify for these for a streamlined CEQA process. So a lot of information about CEQA, but just to kind of give you a sense of what we're trying to do in California and where the push is coming from in California from a policy perspective. I didn't put any slides up about what the kind of big solutions are, so I'll just kind of give you my bullet point cheat sheet here. And my personal view, and I think from having done some of these white papers and gathered real estate developers, it starts really with local planning. And that's what's been missing in California a lot, is communities getting together in a comprehensive way and figuring out how they want to develop. What's the future going to be? What is their downtown going to look like? Where are the jobs going to be? Where are the shops going to be? Where's the new housing? Can we accommodate all the different demographics in our community? When people are seniors in 2025, where are they going to live? If we want our kids to come back in our communities, where do we want them to live? So it's that whole visioning process that needs to happen really in every California community, because local governments have the control over land use, and we need to really get people engaged in that process. Otherwise, it becomes just something that communities do, and then the developers come along and there's ad hoc approvals for projects, and then you get people who just start suing, and we end up with planning by lawsuits. And it's not an effective way, and the stakes are simply too great because, as we saw from the pie chart, so many greenhouse gases are coming out of the driving and the land use patterns we have in the state that we need to do something about it, and we can't just sit back on business as usual. And the hope is too, if you start to engage people in this planning process, that you don't get just those 20 angry people on a Tuesday night at a local planning hearing, or complaining about some project. Hopefully you get a broad-based level of support. So I think fundamentally it's got to start there. And to make that happen, we need more dollars for local governments to do this planning. There's a meeting across the street after this talk. I don't think they weren't waiting for my talk to finish, but just so happens that the Air Resources Board is going to be discussing what to do with auction revenue that comes from the cap and trade program and from auctioning off of allowances. And if someone were to ask me, and nobody's asked me, but I'm going to tell you right now, I think some of the money should go to local governments so they can do this planning, because I think it's that critical. And nothing can really happen without it. Unless you get that in there, you're not going to get the kind of land use patterns we need. The regional efforts by SB 375 are great, but it needs to be matched by local governments, because a lot of the development we want to see is frankly illegal in California. It's illegal in the sense that you've got height limits, you've got zoning restrictions on the types of uses you can put in places. So we don't allow the market it's not a free market when it comes to land use. So if there's a parcel where it would be cost effective to build a high-rise skyscraper, the neighbors would say no way, and it's not going to happen. They shunt it off to industrial areas that they're trying to redevelop, lower income communities that aren't organized to fight back. And it costs a lot of money to build in these areas because there's no market there. And now with redevelopment agencies gone, the mechanism for public support is gone as well. So, we need to have a better, more comprehensive view of where we're going to grow in the state, and it can't just be shunted off into these, outlying areas. So infrastructure development is also part of that. If you're going to build more compact communities, you need to have good infrastructure, and that's hard for local governments to get funds for that. There are some ideas being bandied about, infrastructure finance districts, for example, where you could maybe use the increment of tax revenue that you'll get in the future and borrow against that. Different methods along those lines. A third, and I'll just give one more after this, a third one would be tax reform. So maybe you've heard of Prop 13, which says that we have to have 2/3 majority to raise taxes, and it's basically gutted the property tax revenue that local governments get, so they've now started to rely on sales tax revenue to fund local government services, since they can't get much out of homes anymore on property taxes. So their incentives now are to green light big box stores. Those are going to bring revenue in. Housing is not going to bring in a lot of money for local government. So the whole tax structure is screwed up in that respect. And then the final piece of it, there are a lot of pieces, but the big picture ones, to my mind, is transit, and making sure that we have an adequately funded transit system. And that's a whole separate suite of issues, but I think you need that as well. And of course, it's not just about transit. I've seen charts comparing the United States and Europe, for example, greenhouse gas emissions and the modes of travel. And our public transit usage in the United States is on par, actually, with a lot of the European countries that we would associate with having a very car-free type of lifestyle. The difference is that they bike ride a lot more. So if you've been to Amsterdam, for example, you see bikers everywhere. There's other ways. We don't have to necessarily build a gold-plated subway system. We can just build safe paths for walking and biking, and that can make a big difference in a lot of communities, and it can do it right away. You don't need a big investment. So that was a lot of talk about land use, but hey, I showed you the pie chart. That was 40% of the pie chart, so I think I was entitled to take 40% of the time, potentially. So I want to move on to another topic. We're talking about the business of fighting climate change, so that was the land use infill piece, and I want to talk now about energy efficiency. Not the most sexy of topics. I think people like to talk more about solar panels on the roofs. That's cool. You can show your neighbors. You can feel really good about it. Energy efficiency I don't think it leaps out at people. But what I'm talking about here is making your homes and businesses more energy efficient. And it's talk about lowest hanging fruit is absolutely the best way to go. And I got a little chart here from the Energy Commission that shows you where greenhouse gas emissions come from in a more broken down way. And you can see that 14% of the emissions come from residential buildings, from the energy usage associated with residential buildings, and another 8% from commercial buildings. total of 22% of our greenhouse gas emissions comes from those sources. So it's a nice wedge to tackle, and also, as I'll show in a slide or two, it's cost effective. So what are we really talking about? We're talking about the energy usage. Here's another pie chart showing where the typical profile of greenhouse gas emissions from a building. So you can think about this in terms of your own home. You've got miscellaneous, that's a lot of stuff, but lighting, for example, 12%, cold storage, 13%, heating, 15%, water heating, 17%. So we're talking about all these systems in our homes and businesses that use energy and then have greenhouse gas emissions as a result. When we talk about it being cost effective, here's, some of you may have seen this. This is a study from the McKinsey Company looking at cost abatement curves. So in other words, what's it going to cost to do all the things we need to do to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So everything above that horizontal line there, so over to the right, that's all expensive stuff to do. Everything over to the left is the cheap stuff. And I'm sure none of you have eagle eyes to be able to see the writing here, but you can see there's lighting, insulation. I mean, those are two big ones right there that are the most cost-effective things you can do to energy efficiency improvements. And you can see there a bunch in there. If you're curious what the most expensive things are, gas plant, carbon sequestration retrofits, coal retrofits, coal plant retrofits. So question.
I have a quick question. Is this based on California data or is this nationwide data?
I believe this is nationwide. That's a good question. I don't know. Does anyone know?
Yeah, it's nationwide.
Okay, nationwide. And we have a great story to tell here in California. I think there's some folks, I know there's a few folks in the Energy Commission here. I mean, if you ever want to get back with your out-of-state relatives or friends who make fun of California, just get a tattoo of this and just show it to them, because this is where we really shine. We're dysfunctional in many ways in the state, but when it comes to energy efficiency and how much money and emissions we've saved the state, this chart shows us. So basically what happened is there was a governor in the state a long, long time ago. His name was Jerry Brown. It's kind of an unusual name for a governor, but he actually was a governor. It's a joke. I know he's a governor now again. So anyway, he was big on energy efficiency, and the Energy Commission was started at the time, and there's a focus. Actually, Chairman Weissenmiller of the Energy Commission, I think, was one of the leading forces behind this during the 70s. But we need to have our new buildings become more energy efficient. So building standards were put in place. Title 24. They continue to be kind of ratcheted tighter, and as a result, our per capita energy emissions or energy consumption has remained flat. We're that bottom line there, and nationwide it's kept going up and up. So we've been able to stay very efficient. We've saved a ton of money, and we've averted the construction of a lot of new power plants as a result. And when you think about it, all this push for renewable energy, all this push for new transmission lines, and we turn on a big screen TV, and that's 10% of the electricity usage in the state, from television watching. And can we be more smart and efficient about about all these things that we're so desperate to supply electricity for? And so that's really what this is about. And when you do this, and I'm giving the commercial for these retrofits, when you do this kind of thing, you're not only saving money, but it's a job creator, and I think that was a big reason why the Obama administration around the stimulus funding was very interested in helping to fund some of these efficiency retrofit programs. So Sonoma County, there's some data there. They had a program called PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy Program. It was actually innovated in Berkeley. It became state law, and it's quickly started spreading to other states. And basically, it's a financing method to do these retrofits. So let's say you want to upgrade your home, make it more energy efficient. You can essentially go to your local government, sign some forms, and they will essentially pay for that job to be done in your house. And then you pay that local government back with an assessment on your property tax bill. So, and the idea is the savings in your energy bill is greater than what you're paying back on your property tax bill. It's an assessment. We have assessments all the time in local governments. You assess homes in a certain neighborhood to bury the electricity lines or to do improvements on parks, things like that. This was a similar model. Unfortunately, it got held up at the federal level. Federal regulators decided this program was a threat to creditors, to home creditors, because local governments have what's called lien priority. So if, let's say, the homeowner were to go bankrupt, go into foreclosure, who gets paid back? Well, local governments get paid back first, and then the banks and everyone else. And they didn't like the idea that these PACE assessments would get paid back first. and it would potentially put at risk banks, but also put at risk the federal government too, because the federal government was underwriting so many of these loans. I think the concerns were really overblown. There were a lot of protections in place with the program. Even if worst case scenario there was a bankruptcy and the home went into foreclosure, the only money that would have to be paid back to the local government is the amount that was delinquent. So there should be a new homeowner that would come in and would get the benefits of the upgrade. And so even worst case scenario, there wasn't much exposure there, I don't think. There's been lawsuits. California Attorney General filed a lawsuit, a number of other states, environmental organizations. There's some split decisions. There's now a rulemaking process. We'll see what happens. There's actually bipartisan support for this, though, in Congress even. There's one of the Tea Party congressmen from New York. She's co-authored a bill to try to overturn what was done at the federal level. And I think part of it is that's local control. This is not a kind of hippie agenda here. This is about giving people the right to exercise, kind of sovereignty over how their local governments behave, and it also has great environmental benefits. So this is data from Sonoma County here. They just within this 2-year period, they were entered in. You can see how many improvements and contracts. It had to do with renewables as well as energy efficiency and water. They bonded over $43 million, created over 550 jobs. And I should also point out that and construction jobs increased 7.5%, while their neighboring counties were declining. So I think there's, it's somewhat, I shouldn't say anecdotal, but it's a small amount. For one county, it's small data in a sense, but it also gives you an indication of the huge market share out there and the potential to really scale up an industry of folks who can do this kind of retrofitting work, and that there is some demand there if you get it right. And so I want to do another kind of solution summary here. So I'm talking about the problems and the areas, the big picture areas. But when it comes to solving this problem, a big picture issue is the financing. So PACE gets at that, because to do this kind of work, it's money that's invested up front, but the payout happens over time. And a lot of people don't have that money up front. If they do, this is particularly true for businesses, they don't want to necessarily spend that money on insulation. I mean, if you're a business, you might rather invest in your core product line. You have a greater rate of return. So it's hard to make that case. So we can make the financing easy, like through the PACE program. That becomes very very attractive to folks. There's other financing methods too. If you're buying a home, you can ask your home lending institution about energy efficiency mortgages, where it becomes an additional mortgage that you can qualify for, that where the money will go specifically to upgrading your home. And the idea is that you will save money in the long term, more than the monthly additional payment you have to make on your mortgage. A lot of banks aren't even aware of this and aren't even training their salespeople to kind of promote this option. And of course, all this should first be preceded by an energy audit. So you should get someone in there who can do an energy audit. It's pretty neat. They have infrared kind of things where they look at where air is leaking out of your house. Heard some pretty crazy stories from Fresno, for example, where they had an energy audit program down there, and they went into someone's home, someone who was spending $800 a month on their electricity bill, and they went up into the attic and they found a hole the size of a basketball in their duct system. I think a squirrel had burrowed in there. And basically this individual was just air conditioning the attic and heating the attic in the wintertime, and all that energy was just a total waste. This is a horror story, but who knows how many other squirrel holes are going around or happening in California that we could be getting in and fixing and saving a lot of money. So just something to think about. I think ultimately though, we do need triggers, because nobody wants to have this work done in their home. I mean, let's face it, it's really disruptive. Who wants to have someone come into your house and blow insulation into your walls and do all this work? You don't even know how to begin finding appropriate people to do the work. You may not even know how much you would save. People haven't even heard about this kind of stuff, so it's a tough challenge. You get some early adopters, but ultimately I think we need some triggers. By triggers, I mean when you sell a house, maybe there has to be some sort of mandatory requirement. Certainly some jurisdictions around the world, in the United States, have done this, where there's a mandatory energy audit that you require for someone who's buying a new home, or maybe at the time of lease, or maybe it's every 10 years in an office building. A lot of people don't like it, realtors don't like it, people involved in property management, but I think we need to get to that point. The other thing too is that, let's say when people are getting a new water heater, when their water heater breaks, that's a perfect time to tell them and have a mechanism in place where the energy efficient option is promoted to them. Or when they're getting their roof redone, that's a perfect time to get up there and do some new insulation and put in energy efficiency measures. So, we need to think about getting those key decision points, getting in front of people, those key decision points. And then finally, it's about making sure we have a workforce, contractors who can do this stuff, who are trained, who people have confidence in. Another anecdote from Fresno, when they did some polling on it, they found that people really didn't trust contractors. They just pick up, flip open the phone book or Google someone to do retrofits. They had no idea the quality of these people. And they didn't trust government to do it either. So they didn't want government to come in, and they didn't want private contractors to come in. But if government recommended a contractor, somehow that was okay. So I don't understand the psychology behind that, but people love a government-supported list of contractors. So you go on a list, and there's your 10 that you can choose from. So that kind of solution, may be something that that other local governments can implement. Of course, it takes money too to get these programs up and running. So that's another factor. But ultimately, we'll need some good standards, so we know we've got trained, capable people. You can do some damage to a home if you're a bad retrofit contractor. So it's about having those workforce standards, and it's about making sure that local governments are part of that process. So that's on the energy efficiency side. Now we can get into the really sexy stuff. Renewable energy, solar panels, wind turbines. California, we have a goal here of 33% of our energy must come from renewable sources by 2020. I put together, this is my work. I know it's pretty impressive. I mean, it's not CGI, but it's bar charts here. You can see our progress since 2003. And, kind of hovering around 13-ish% up until about 08. And you see 09, we had some stimulus dollars and some major price declines in solar panels. And we were supposed to be at 20% by 2010. That didn't happen, but they did make it to 20% by 2011. And there are some people who think we may blow past the 33% goal by 2020, maybe up to 40%. Maybe that's too optimistic. Right now a lot of these are just contracts that can fail. And the projects, when we get to implementation stage, can fail. But we're moving in that direction. And I like to think of there are two ways of accomplishing this goal, to kind of boil it down simplistically. So we have large central station, those giant solar farms out in the desert. I flew down to LA on Monday, and I looked out the window, and I saw Coalinga, if any of you drive I-5, and then I looked north, and I saw this massive field that looked bigger than Coalinga, and maybe some of you heard of this project. I had to Google it when I got back to the hotel, and there's a giant bright source